Chapter 13. Della went up the stairs to her home hoping to check on her children and finding them asleep. As she walked to Perry's room she opened the door as quietly as she could. Yes, he was asleep in his bed. He was safe and unaware of anything that had happened on that terrible night. But, as Della shut the door she heard the quiet sobs coming from Sally's room. Sally was her oldest daughter and too old not to know the truth. As hard as it would be for her to hear what had happened to Paul from her mom, the thought that she could hear it from the television or a stranger was a much worse scenario. Sally had been in bed when she had heard her mom walk up the stairs and stop in at her brother's room. She wanted to know how her Uncle Paul and all her friends at the lodge were. She sat up in her bed as she heard her mother's soft knock. Her mom must have heard her crying and Sally wiped her eyes. "Come on in, Mom," she said. As Sally looked into her mother's eyes the tears started again. She did not have to hear the words, she knew that her Uncle Paul had died. She knew that she wasn't supposed to watch TV after 10 at night. But how could she sleep? The man on the television had said there were many dead and she had felt a large lump grow in her throat. Della took her little girl in her arms and cried with her. She had been the best of friends with Paul for 8 years. Sue was her best friend and had been in her bridal party. Paul Jr. had spent so many days and nights at her home that she felt as though he was her son. Even though there was no blood relationship, Paul Jr. had always called her Aunt Della as Sally had called him Uncle Paul. She thought of the many times her friend's familiar knock had sounded at the office door, the meetings, the barbecues. They would never be the same. Now, Sue was pregnant and Paul would never get to meet his baby. It was too much. Finally Sally went to sleep and Della took the long walk to her own lonely bedroom, for Perry was still out there and she was sure that his life was once more in danger also. Bob Haskell was still at the lodge attempting to help out with the chaos. He had watched his longtime friends shot and murdered in front of him and he was still in a state of shock. He had been over at the buffet table getting a drink of punch when the shooting had begun. As a lawyer that specialized in probate cases, he had never found himself in any danger. He had no way to protect himself, and had watched the shooting in horror. For some reason he had not been picked as a target. It had seemed to him that the shooters had particular target in mind and as if the shooting was not random. Dave Martin had not been interested in the abortion issue. Up until 3 weeks ago he had not been interested in what was going on. That is, until his secretary had come to him and told him that she was going to have his child. As a married man, that posed a real dilemma for him. He had no plans to leave his wife and family, and now he was facing fatherhood. Abortion had never been an option for him, but she had felt that it was her right. After just a few days she had come to him and told him that she had an abortion. For Dave his world changed in an instant. He had gone over what he was going to say to his wife and had decided that honesty would be the best policy. He actually had been looking forward to seeing the new baby and planned to be a father to it no matter what happened. But with the swift cut of the scalpel his dreams and child had become pieces of tissue. Something inside him had died that night. Dave had become an anti-abortion activist and had met with a few men that were of the same interest. Like a fool he had listened to them and invited the 2 men into the lodge on that evening. He had no idea what the men were going to do. In his non-lawyer mind, he had ignored all cautions and invited virtual strangers who had weighed out ideas on abortions into the lodge that night. His last memories on this earth would be the shooter raising his gun walking toward high. Dreams and child had become pieces of tissue. Something inside him had died that night. Dave had become an anti-abortion activist and had met with a few men that were of the same interest. Like a fool he had listened to them and invited the 2 men into the lodge on that evening. He had no idea what the men were going to do. In his non-lawyer mind, he had ignored all cautions and invited virtual strangers who had weighed out ideas on abortions into the lodge that night. His last memories on this earth would be the shooter raising his gun walking toward him and shooting him right in the chest. Jess Martin had been in the seat next to her husband when the shooting had started. It had been a bad night and she had wanted to go home. Her marriage to Dave had been on the rocks for weeks, months now, and she had wanted to leave the lodge. The crowd and the yelling had made her very uncomfortable, but her husband had insisted that everything would be fine. She had been looking right at the gunman as he had taken direct aim at her husband and shot. Dave had grabbed her and thrown her to the floor, saving her life. She was now standing outside of the lodge waiting for what the police had planned for her. After all, she was a witness to her husband's murder and so many others that evening. As the two gunmen had run from the lodge that evening, they had jumped into the Ford. That dreams and child had become pieces of tissue. Something inside him had died that night. Dave had become an anti-abortion activist and had met with a few men that were of the same interest. Like a fool, he had listened to them and invited the two men into the lodge on that evening. He had no idea what the men were going to do. In his non-lawyer mind, he had ignored all cautions and invited virtual strangers who had weighed out ideas on abortions into the lodge that night. His last memories on this earth would be the shooter raising his gun, walking toward him and shooting him right in the chest. Jess Martin had been in the seat next to her husband when the shooting had started. It had been a bad night and she had wanted to go home. Her marriage to Dave had been on the rocks for weeks, months now, and she had wanted to leave the lodge. The crowd and the yelling had made her very uncomfortable, but her husband had insisted that everything would be fine. As the two men ran into the old Ford that they had purchased as the sole reason of the shooting, the car barely moved on its own and they were surprised that the police were not in hot pursuit of them. As they came around the corner to their home, the car was quickly placed in the garage. For now the car was out of sight and they were safe. Each of the men looked to make sure that no one had seen them. Satisfied that everything was fine, they went on into the house. Chapter 14. Life in the United States had been good for the two men who had taken advantage of the constitutional right to freedom of speech. But, on this night, they had stepped way beyond the right to speak. This was going to be the trial of the century, if they ever got to trial. Where did their rights end? What about the murders of children? Did people really support the right? Could they be looked at as martyrs? Now, the challenge was to begin. Tom Rogers and George Ramsey were two normal, natural-born men who believed in the right of a child to life. They were sick and tired of the women who cried that they had the right to choose what they did with their bodies. Under no circumstance was there a reason to end a life, no matter what the reason, no matter what the age. But now, they had themselves committed the ultimate crime. They had killed and were no longer innocent. As Joni Rogers heard the car pull into the garage, she cringed. She heard the loud old Ford clatter and knew that her husband of 10 years had come home. Tom had been a good father to their children, but he had always ruled the home. She had little say in his world, and if she ever confronted him, the beatings would become so severe that she had nearly died twice at his hands. The television had been on that evening when she had looked on in horror as she listened and watched the wounded being put into ambulance after ambulance. The police were everywhere, and then she had heard that the police were looking for an old Ford. Joni didn't want to believe that her husband had been involved, but the thought had crossed her mind. To say he was a cool customer was an understatement. To everyone that knew him, he was a kind and caring father. He worked hard and provided a good home, but had many violent outbursts that he had managed to keep hidden from the rest of the world. Tom was in no mood for any grief from his wife, and as he opened the kitchen door, he expected dinner to be ready. It was good for her that she was at the stove and had one of his favorite dishes awaiting her. If he was going to jail or the ever after, he was going to go with a full stomach. Tom and George sat at the table and watched Joni. If she suspected anything, she was hiding it well. She was pleasant to them and the food was delicious. The television had been on that evening when she had looked on in horror as she listened and watched the wounded being put into ambulance after ambulance. The police were everywhere, and then she had heard that the police were looking for an old Ford. Joni didn't want to believe that her husband had been involved, but the thought had crossed her mind. To say he was a cool customer was an understatement. To everyone that knew him, he was a kind and caring father. He worked hard and provided a good home, but had many violent outbursts that he had managed to keep hidden from the rest of the world. George enjoyed the meal that he was sharing with his friend Tom. The shooting had left him hungry. He couldn't understand why, but it had been over so fast that what had happened that night had not yet sunk in. George was now a single father, as his wife had left him and taken his children 2 years ago. The courts had been so biased against him and his beliefs that he had been lucky to keep the right to see his children without supervision. This had started a downward spiral. He felt as though women controlled nearly every aspect of family life. They were honored by the court, the police and the doctors. Dana Ramsey had been coming home from work when she had driven by the lodge where the shooting was. She had found herself stuck in traffic and had spent nearly an hour in traffic. She had a chance to watch the people and what had happened. She thought of her ex-husband George and his rantings on the subject. He was so unreasonable on some subjects that talking to him had done no good. As his ex-wife, she was well aware of his thoughts on the subject and for a flash of a second wondered if he had anything to do with this horrific act. Tom was now in full thought mood. He and his friend needed to get rid of any evidence. As he said goodbye to his partner in crime, he knew that he needed to keep the outward appearance of someone who knew nothing. He went to the shower and took a thorough one. He needed to make sure that he got rid of any evidence. As he removed his clothes, he was very careful. As he went outside to the fire pit, he made sure that his clothes were completely burned. Sam Rogers was now a young man of 13 and much wiser to what was. George was now a single father, as his wife had left him and taken his children 2 years ago. The courts had been so biased against him and his beliefs that he had been lucky to keep the right to see his children without supervision. This had started a downward spiral. He felt as though women controlled nearly every aspect of family life. They were honored by the court, the police and the doctors. Going on at his home then, apparently his parents knew. He had looked out his parents' kitchen window and watched his father burn his clothes. Thoughts crossed his mind quickly, and as he climbed the stairs to his room he thought of the man on his paper route. The famous attorney was who he needed to see, Perry Mason. He would wait until it was safe and sneak out of the house. Quietly Sam went down the stairs and out the back door. His father was in his office and his mother had gone downstairs to do some laundry, and he had made his escape. As he walked the 2 short blocks to the Masons' home, he thought of George was now a single father, as his wife had left him and taken his children 2 years ago. The courts had been so biased against him and his beliefs that he had been lucky to keep the right to see his children without supervision. This had started a downward spiral. He felt as though women controlled nearly every aspect of family life. They were honored by the court, the police and the doctors. His father? Was he capable of such a horrific act? He needed a lawyer, and a good one. He had always been told that Mr. Mason was the best. Unable to sleep, Della had gone to the kitchen to get some warm milk when she had heard someone walk onto the porch. Not wanting to disturb her family any more than it already was, she opened the door to find the paperboy. Chapter 15. Chapter 15. There was nothing in Perry or Paul Sr.'s mind, but to find out any information that they could obtain from Mark Washington. He was lying in bed, definitely under the influence of medication, but they needed to know what was happening. As the 2 men walked over to the man, a doctor entered the room and said that they were going to have to leave the room. It had already been nearly 2 hours since the shooting, and Perry and Paul were in no mood to leave. However, they both were aware that if they did not obey the doctor's orders they could be escorted from the emergency room, perhaps the hospital. Della was surprised to see Sam on her doorstep. It was very late and he was young, only about 13. She knew that his father was a member of the lodge and wondered what would bring him to her home at such a time. She opened the door and let the young man in. Sam had known Mrs. Mason ever since he had started the paper route a year ago. He knew her to be very friendly, and at this point he was very aware that he was going to have to trust someone. He looked her in the eyes and said, "Is your husband home? I think I might need to talk to a lawyer." At this point of the evening Della knew that something was very wrong with this young man. He looked terrified and was shaking uncontrollably. She smiled at the young man and said, "I am sorry, my husband is out on a case at the moment. Perhaps I can help you." Sam was listening for the familiar sound of his father's car. At this point he knew that if his father found him at the Mason's house his life could be in danger. What a fool I am. I left my car in the yard. If Dad sees it, he'll come in, he thought to himself. Tom was at home in his office. He was listening to the list of the dead and Mark Washington had been listed as injured. He had not died and this put him in real danger. For Tom was the only man that could positively identify him. He needed to go to the hospital and finish the job that he had started before the man exposed him. As he went into his closet he opened the box with the doctor's outfit along with a stethoscope. He would change into the clothes in a restroom along the way. He knew that the emergency room was located on the first floor and if needed he could escape from one of the windows. As Tom made the short drive to the hospital he took a shortcut. As he drove by one of the houses for a moment he thought that his son's bike had been on the front lawn. But, he was in a hurry and he had driven right by. Sam cringed as he was sure that he had seen his father go by the house in his car. But the car had continued down the road and he breathed a breath of relief. It was then that he looked at Della and said, "I was home tonight when my dad came in with his friend George Ramsey. They are very secretive and sometimes I feel very uncomfortable around them. But this night they were very secretive. They had bought an old Ford that rattled and clanged, and tonight they had driven it. They hadn't been gone long, so I wondered where they had been." At this point Sam took a deeper breath and Della waited for the next words. Sam cleared his throat and continued. "I never thought that my father was capable of any real violence, but what I saw tonight makes me wonder if he was involved with the shooting at the lodge. You see, they were driving the car that the police are looking for, I think, and my father took a shower at a strange time for him. That in itself didn't really catch my eye until I saw him in our backyard at the fire pit. He was burning his clothes." Della knew what this meant. His father was very likely to be involved in the slaughter at the lodge and she needed to get word to Perry. She said in her calmest voice, "Do you know where your father is now?" Sam shook his head. "I think he's home, but he may have gone by your house. I saw his car go by a few moments ago. He's on his way to the hospital." Della thought. She picked up her phone and called Perry immediately. As Perry had stepped out of the room where Mark Washington was he thought for a moment. He had heard that voice before. Just as that thought crossed his mind Della called. "Perry, I think that one of the shooters is on the way to the hospital and he is Tom Rogers." Perry was on the move now. He knew who the doctor was. It was one of the shooters. His voice had been disguised, but Perry knew. He motioned to the officer who had been guarding the door and slammed it open. To his dismay Tom Rogers was nowhere in sight and Mark Washington was dead. Now, Tom was in real trouble. He was headed where? No matter where he went he knew that people would be looking for him. He had been a fool and so sure of himself. Now, he had to stop Perry Mason. His son's bike. That's how Perry had found out. It was his son's bike. "I must go to the Masons and confront Sam. He will understand," he thought hopefully. As Perry relayed to Della what was happening Sam panicked. He knew his father would be coming for him and he was sure that the Mason household were in mortal danger also. Something told Della that she had to leave the house. She ran up the stairs yelling to Karen. Sam was right behind her and as Sally came out of her room he grabbed her. Della didn't know where to go. She couldn't find her keys in the panic. Then she remembered she didn't have a car there. Hers was at the dealer's and Perry had the other one. Perry was on his way to his home along with half of the police force. They all knew the danger that Della and her family were in. They also needed to go to Tom Rogers' home and protect his family. Della knew that Tom would be coming into the house and so for the first time in her life she grabbed the gun. Nervously she grabbed the bullets and ran with her family to the pool house. She had been on the phone with Perry the whole time and he knew exactly where she could be found. As they entered the pool house, they heard the sound of a strange car coming into the driveway. Della had to keep everyone safe as they hid and listened to a man break a window to gain entrance into the home. They were trapped and their only hope was for the police to arrive before the madman found them. Chapter 16. Chapter 16. At this moment Della was listening. She couldn't see anything, then she heard the door to the pool house open. The man laughed as he turned on the light and met Della, her children and his son huddling and shaking in fear. As he lifted his pistol to take a shot at the woman who stood there shaking, he saw for an instant the muzzle of her gun. The flash of the bullet as it left the chamber was the last thing that Tom saw. Della stood there for a moment, trying to take in what she had just done. Working for Perry, she had learned long ago that life could be ended in a moment's time, and she could see that the man was dead. She had killed the man who was responsible for killing Paul and many other friends that night. Sam looked down at his father. For some reason he could not find the tears. His father had come to kill him, he was sure. He had seen the smirk on his father's face as he had started to raise his gun. Mrs. Mason had saved his and the rest of their lives. Perry was on his way to his home when he spotted the strange car in the driveway. He barely stopped and ran towards the house. It was then that he heard the single shot. The shot had come from the pool house. It had come from the place where his wife, family nanny and Tom's son Sam had been hiding. He was on his way at the fastest pace he could go. He was followed by his friend Andy Anderson, who had his gun drawn at this point. As they called out to the pool house, Perry heard Della's voice. "We are all right, Perry. Tom is dead," she called out. Perry watched as his family and friends came out of the little pool house, obviously shaken but all right. He grabbed them and hugged them with all the love that he could convey. Lieutenant Anderson looked into the pool house, and there on the floor lay Tom, dead. He had been shot once in the chest. He had died almost immediately by the lack of blood, he was sure. Sergeant Blake was waiting to speak to this man. This terrible man who was now facing murder charges with the death of 14 so far and more to come, he was sure. He had 2 dead officers also and a young rookie who may not ever be able to be an officer again. He had been shot in the foot and 2 of his toes had to be amputated. It was a terrible thing. Joni Rogers had been in the living room pacing when she had looked through her large picture window and saw at least 4 police officers pull in. She had watched as her husband had left for God knows where once again that night and had been sincerely worried. Sam had left without her knowledge and she was worried sick about him. It was now past midnight, no, nearly 1 a.m., and the police were here. As she opened the door to the nice sergeant, she knew that her life would never be the same again. George Ramsey had just sat down in his large chair when he had heard the sounds of the police cars coming into the driveway. He knew that it was useless to resist them at this point. He was going to go to Plan B. This plan was where he and his friend Tom were going to appeal to the public for their understanding. George went peacefully that evening, not knowing that his partner had died. Sue and Jen Drake had not been able to sleep. How could they sleep with their son and husband dead? They both were startled when they heard the phone ring. Sue picked up the phone and heard her father-in-law's voice. Everything was all right and the murderers had been caught. "I will be there soon. Take care and try to get some sleep," he told them. The next few days were a blur to all the friends. There had been a large mass to honor all the victims held at the church in the neighborhood. It had been an All Souls service with every kind of religion welcome. Perry had been one of the main speakers and somehow he had managed to keep his composure. So many friends and family and no explanation of exactly why these 2 men had done so much. As he looked into the eyes of the people whose lives had been destroyed that night, his heart melted. Never would his family feel completely safe again. His wife had killed someone. How could he help her deal with that? His daughter and son had witnessed a murder. Life was going to need some serious changes. Perry Jr. had been forced to grow up way past what a young child such as he should have known, and Sally had been just a few feet from the man that had aimed his gun at her. Sue had a private funeral for Paul. There had been a large crowd and once more Perry had honored his friend. Once they arrived at the graveyard, he watched his best friend's wife Sue bend over her husband's coffin and give it a kiss. He put his arm around her. "I will see that you and Paul will always be safe. I promise." And with that he gave her a kiss on the cheek. Sue gave the man who she knew was sincere a hug, and the two walked together away from Paul's grave.